Whether you're a bioprocess engineer hunting for the perfect scaled-down model, a biotech founder architecting the leap to commercialization, or a scientific analyst who craves raw technical truth, you've reached the technical edge. In this space, we live by a single mantra: the process is the product. Welcome to the Biomanufacturing and Fermentation Technology podcast with Prasad Ernala. Hit subscribe and ring the bell to join a global community and stay at the vanguard of biotech translation. Let's build the bioindustrial future together.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are stepping into the uncomfortable but really critical world of corporate mortality. We spend an immense amount of time talking about how biotechnology companies are born, the venture capital, the ribbon cuttings, the breakthroughs, but we rarely talk about how they die, and more importantly, what happens to the incredible science they've built when the money runs out.
It is a grim topic, but a necessary one. We're looking at what the literature calls the governance of decline. When a science-heavy company goes into insolvency, does all that value just evaporate? Or is it simply moving to a new owner?
That is the question. And the core debate we're having today is specific. Should our insolvency frameworks be, radically redesigned to treat things like process know-how and human capital as protected assets? Or, as I suspect you might argue, does the current market-driven approach of just prioritizing creditor recovery, does that remain the most efficient way to clear out failure?
You suspect correctly. I believe that while, yes, the loss of knowledge is unfortunate, insolvency proceedings have to prioritize legal certainty and settling debts. I worry that the reforms you're likely to propose, things like government intervention or custodianship, could distort market signals and, frankly, prop up firms that aren't viable.
I see why you'd think that, but let me offer a different perspective. My position is that current insolvency frameworks have a structural bias against innovation. They destroy valuable public and private investment by treating complex biotech IP like it's, generic furniture or real estate. We are seeing a systemic loss of value, and I believe we need a policy overhaul.
And I come at it from a different angle. I'd argue that if this process know-how is truly as valuable as you say, then the private market buyers should be willing to pay to retain it without government mandates. I'm very skeptical of redefining human capital as a protected asset. Employees are not property you can secure. But let's get into the details.
Let's do that. I want to start with a fundamental assertion. Biotech failure is rarely just about bad science.
Wow, that's a pretty bold claim. Usually, companies fail because the product doesn't work or the market doesn't want it.
In software or retail, perhaps, but the source material highlights that many biotech firms entering insolvency have technically viable platforms. They have validated fermentation processes, regulatory relevant data, and highly trained teams. The failure is often financial. A missed milestone, a dry funding landscape, that funding valley of death between R&D and commercialization. The problem is that our standard insolvency regimes are optimized for tangible assets.
Tangible assets, right. Like equipment, inventory, buildings. Things you can sell to pay back the bank.
Precisely. But in biotech, the real value is incompletely codified. It resides in what the literature calls tacit scale-up expertise, deviation histories, and the team itself. The moment a distress notice is issued, that human capital just exits. The scientists find new jobs, and when they leave, they turn these potentially valuable platforms into fragmented and underpriced scraps. My thesis is that we need a policy that recognizes process know-how as a protected asset to prevent these hidden innovation failure points.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that entirely. I acknowledge the complexity of biotech, but you seem to be conflating the company with its assets. The fundamental purpose of insolvency is to settle debts and release resources to more productive uses.
But are they being released to productive uses if all the knowledge is lost in the process?
If that knowledge was worth saving, the buyer would hire the team. I worry that what you're suggesting, adding regulatory burdens or these knowledge transfer windows, risks scaring away investors. If you tell a creditor, look, you can't liquidate this asset until you've paid for a 6-month knowledge transfer, you are just prolonging the firm's inevitable death. You're creating a zombie company.
I'm not convinced by that because it assumes the market has perfect information. But let's dig into the first core disagreement here, the nature of the asset itself. We need to distinguish between tangible IP, like a patent document, and this tacit know-how.
A patent is a legal title. It's distinct. It's saleable. It grants a monopoly on an invention. That's a clear asset class that bankruptcy courts understand perfectly well.
Do they? In this sector, I would argue a patent is not a standalone asset. Let's take the example of fermentation and biomanufacturing. Success there depends on variables like mixing rates, oxygen transfer efficiency, and fouling behavior inside the bioreactor.
Those sound like standard engineering challenges.
But the solutions to them are rarely fully documented in the standard operating procedures, the SOPs. This is tacit knowledge. It's the result of years of troubleshooting. A patent gives you the recipe, sure, but the team holds the expertise on how to actually cook the meal without burning the kitchen down. If you treat that patent as a saleable unit without all the underlying context, the data packages, the regulatory history, the human memory of every failure mode, you are systematically undervaluing the asset.
That's an interesting point, though. I'd frame it differently. You're describing context dependence. And I agree, a patent without context is worth less. But I would argue that if a company hasn't codified its knowledge, well, that's a management failure, not a policy failure.
You can't write down every intuition a scientist has about how a specific yeast strain reacts to a temperature spike. It's impossible to codify that kind of touch.
Perhaps not every intuition, but you can certainly codify the critical data. Look, if the value is so tacit that it exists only in the heads of 3 people, that is an incredibly risky asset to begin with. You're suggesting we force buyers to acquire this messy human capital. From a buyer's perspective, forcing them to take on a team complicates due diligence, and ultimately it lowers recovery rates for creditors because the asset comes with all these strings attached.
It's not about strings attached, it's about making sure the asset is actually functional. The source material points out that process know-how is incompletely codified by its very nature, not just through negligence. When the team disperses, that knowledge is unrecoverable. We are effectively throwing away years of R&D because we're using a bankruptcy model that was designed for selling furniture.
But you're asking the insolvency process to solve a documentation problem. If the science is that fragile, maybe it wasn't a viable business to begin with.
That is a harsh assessment. But let's push deeper on this. You mentioned risk. The source material argues that because we treat these assets as simple patents, we create hidden innovation failure points. A buyer picks up the IP at auction, tries to replicate the results, fails because they lack that deviation history, and then they shelve the technology. That is a net loss for society.
It is a loss, I'll grant you that. But is it the bankruptcy court's job to fix that? The court's job is to get the best price for the creditors right now.
But best price is subjective. If you could keep the team together for just 3 months, that price might triple because the asset is de-risked. But the current system demands immediate liquidity.
Which brings us to the mechanics of it. You can't just wish for the team to stay. You can't own people. You can't list John, the lead scientist, on the balance sheet as collateral.
No, but you can create environments that keep John involved. And this leads us to our second point, policy interventions. The source material proposes specific mechanisms like mandatory knowledge transfer windows and trigger-based documentation requirements that kick in when a restructuring begins.
Okay, let's pause on mandatory knowledge transfer windows. That sounds expensive. Who pays the salaries during this window? The company is already out of cash. That is why they're in this mess in the first place.
The proposal suggests using incentives for buyer retention, things like tax credits for keeping technical staff, or utilizing conditional bridge mechanisms, a bit of limited liquidity provided just to execute a transition, not to keep the business running indefinitely.
Conditional bridge mechanisms? That sounds an awful lot like a bailout by another name. It looks dangerously like subsidizing failure. If I'm a taxpayer, why am I paying to bridge a company that the market has already rejected?
It's not subsidizing the company, it's subsidizing the preservation of value. Think about inventor involvement. All the empirical practice shows that keeping the inventor involved is a critical success factor in tech transfer. Yet our current asset sales almost always sever this link. The administrator fires everyone to save cash and then tries to sell the IP. It's completely self-defeating.
That I can agree with. Severing the link is inefficient. But I believe the solution lies in deal structures, not mandates. We should see more transitional consulting or earn-out mechanisms.
I agree. Those are excellent tools.
But they have to be voluntary. If a buyer sees value in the inventor, they will structure an earn-out. If policy mandates it, you might force a buyer to retain a team they don't want or need, which could actually kill the deal entirely.
But the market often fails to see that value until it's too late. The cliff edge between solvency and insolvency is just too steep. Once directors' duties shift to creditors, they're driven toward rapid monetization, a fire sale. They don't have the luxury of structuring a complex earn-out unless policy supports it.
You say fire sale like it's a dirty word. A fire sale is just the market clearing price at a specific moment in time.
But it's a distorted moment. The source material talks about trigger-based documentation requirements. Imagine if, as a condition of receiving R&D tax credits or grants early on, a firm was required to maintain a sort of living will for its data. So when insolvency hits, the data package is already structured.
Now that I find more palatable. A living will for data is a governance requirement like filing your taxes. It doesn't cost the creditor money at the moment of failure, but mandatory retention. That's where I draw the line. You cannot force a scientist to stay on a sinking ship, and you can't force a buyer to pay for them.
You don't force them. You incentivize them. The source mentions buyer retention incentives. If a buyer commits to retaining, say, 50% of the R&D staff for 6 months, perhaps they get a preferential tax treatment on the asset acquisition.
That is creative, but it complicates the tax code to solve a bankruptcy problem. I worry about the unintended consequences. You might have companies buying failed startups just for the tax credits, not for the science.
Better that than the science disappearing entirely.
That brings us to the broader implications. If we don't let these fire sales happen, what are we really protecting? You mentioned earlier this isn't just about money, but about something bigger.
Yes, the third point of our debate: national competitiveness and public custodianship.
This is where I get very nervous.
Hear me out. When these assets are sold in a fire sale, they are often subject to deeply discounted sales. Often, the only entities with the cash and readiness to buy them are foreign competitors. This leads to talent outflows. We lose the scientists, and we weaken our own industrial resilience.
Capital flows where it is treated best. If a foreign entity values the asset more, well, that's the market working.
But is it? If the public sector spent 10 years funding the basic research, and then the company fails due to a short-term cash crunch, and the IP is sold to a foreign entity for pennies on the dollar, that is a failure of national strategy. The source introduces this concept of public stewardship or temporary custodianship.
Temporary custodianship. So the government holds the IP?
Public agencies would act as custodians. They would hold the IP, the data, the critical documentation, just to ensure a structured knowledge transfer can take place, rather than a chaotic liquidation. This isn't state ownership. It's about preventing irreversible innovation loss.
That sounds exactly like state ownership, just with a different label. I strongly question this model. Public agencies lack the expertise to price or manage strategic bioprocess capabilities. How is a government bureaucrat going to know the value of a specific fermentation deviation history?
They don't need to price it. They need to preserve it until the market can price it correctly. They're a freezer, not a chef.
But distressed IP pricing is a valid market signal. It signals a governance failure by the company's board. If the asset is selling for pennies, maybe that's all it's worth in its current state.
Or it signals that the market is ill-equipped to value complex tacit knowledge in a distressed scenario. The source material argues that we need early warning linkages with IP offices. Before the company hits the wall, the IP office helps do some matchmaking with domestic buyers.
I like the idea of matchmaking. Information asymmetry is a real problem. If you can help buyers find these assets before the bankruptcy filing, that's excellent. But that is very, very different from the state taking custody of the IP.
But sometimes, matchmaking isn't enough. When we talk about strategic bioprocess capabilities, things that affect health resilience or food systems, we cannot afford to let them be sold for scrap. The source argues this is about governing decline to protect the innovation capital we've already paid for.
Governing decline is a poetic phrase, but in practice, it often means refusing to let bad businesses die. If the state steps in as a custodian, it risks crowding out private capital. Why would a private distress fund invest if they know the government is going to swoop in and steward all the best assets? You might end up warehousing assets that the market has already rejected.
The goal isn't to warehouse them. It's to bridge the gap. In the current system, we have this binary outcome: success or total liquidation. I'm arguing for a middle ground, where the company fails, but the capability is transitioned in an orderly way.
But who decides what is a capability worth saving? That's the danger. You're asking the government to pick winners from among the losers.
I'm asking the government to protect the infrastructure of innovation. If we let the know-how evaporate, we're hollowing out our own industry.
And I'm saying that if the industry values that infrastructure, it will build mechanisms to save it. Private equity, venture debt, distress funds, they all exist to capture value. If they aren't buying these assets, maybe the assets just aren't as valuable as you think.
Or maybe the transaction costs, specifically the difficulty of transferring tacit knowledge, are too high for them to bear without some kind of policy support.
That's a fair economic argument. High transaction costs can kill a market. But is the answer a new government agency or better standardization of data so those transactions go down naturally?
Standardization helps, but it doesn't solve the human element. You still need the people.
Which brings us right back to the start. You can't own the people.
No, but you can value them.
Let's move to our conclusion, because we're circling the fundamental tension here: efficiency versus preservation.
Agreed. To summarize my position, we have to stop treating these wind-downs as generic financial events. The governance of decline is essential. We've poured years of public and private investment into these technologies. When a firm fails, we have a duty to ensure that the process know-how and the innovation capital aren't erased simply because our laws are designed for selling tables and chairs.
And I will concede this. The tacit nature of biotech data presents a unique challenge that generic bankruptcy law, it just misses it. I agree that a patent without the mixing and oxygen transfer data is largely useful. However, I maintain that the solution lies in better pre-distress management and those early warning linkages, not heavy-handed state custodianship. We should not embrace policies that might crowd out private capital. We just have to be careful not to create a system that refuses to let bad businesses die.
And I think that's the balance we're looking for. Preserving innovation capital requires accepting that the failure of a firm shouldn't mean the erasure of its knowledge.
Ideally, yes, but we have to accept that sometimes clearing the slate is the only way to build something new.
Thank you for joining the debate. We hope this discussion challenges you to consider whether our definition of an asset needs to evolve with our technology.
Until next time, keep questioning the framework.
Hi there, thank you for staying with me until the very end. If these technical insights help bridge the gap in your own process, please hit subscribe and make sure to hit the notification bell. Stay connected for our next deep dive into the realities of biomanufacturing. I am Prasad Ernala. Thanks for listening.